Traditionally, the idea of investing in low maintenance, low cost property in student towns and charging rent has been popular with South Africans. However, Finweek journalist Garth Theunissen went and crunched the numbers, and the investment case for this sector appears to be waning. So we're joined by Garth from Finweek, Jonathan Davies from Pam Golding Properties, and of course Mark's still with us. So Garth, I'll let you begin here. I mean, why did you decide to delve into this space?
Probably because I was a student once myself, and it sort of popped into my head. I specifically looked at places like Grahamstown and Stellenbosch, where you've got large student populations in relatively small towns, meaning that the annual influx of students would have a relatively big impact on the property market in those towns every year. And I was quite surprised to find out that patterns have changed. When I was a student in Grahamstown, the thing to do was to move into a 5, maybe 6 bedroom house with some of your mates. We called it a digs. And that was definitely the favoured route of escaping from the university res. Whereas apparently now that's lost favour completely with the students, and people are much more after 2 bedroom sectional title units that come with dishwashers, a washing machine. It's got all the mod cons, it's quite safe, and apparently that's had quite a big impact on the old 5 bedroom house digs model, where demand has just fallen through the floor, and also the returns on those sort of investments are quite low.
So you've got more discerning students here in South Africa.
And obviously more well-heeled than in my day.
What are your thoughts on kind of the incentive for investing in this type of digs environment, where you've got people who necessarily aren't earning money, or they're earning very low incomes through waitering, whatever it may be?
I'd agree with Garth. I think there has been a move to the high-rise properties, and we're seeing it in Johannesburg CBD, where historically, as Garth said, people would move into digs and they would then commute via bus or 50cc motorbike to Wits. They are now renting student accommodation from companies like South Point, who've actually bought entire buildings, converted them into studios, 1 bedroom apartments, 2 bedroom apartments. They charge anything from R2,500 a month as a rental, right the way through to R10,000 a month if you're close to Gandhi Square. So the trend is definitely to rent those sort of low maintenance units.
I mean, you talk about South Point though. I mean, these are big property developers. What about kind of I suppose if you could call them the retail market, but individual property owners and individual property developers who want to invest in a second property and see the student market as a possible avenue to invest in?
Yep, that's also happening. Yeah.
Also cater to that.
Cater to that. You've got quite a few private investors who do exactly that. They purchase apartments, some of which are renovated, some which aren't, and they convert them into a unit which actually suits your average student. It's got a bed, it's got a microwave, TV, all the basic necessities.
There definitely are some risks involved, and that's one of the things we picked up. I know, obviously it does cater to a slightly more high net worth parent setup, but if you know your son or daughter is going to be at university for 4 years, maybe 5 or 6 years if they're going to do postgrad studies, then there has in the past been a desire to maybe buy a house, let your son stay in res, say, for a year, and then he moves out with a group of his mates. You start teaching him how to manage a property, etc., etc. What we've discovered is that you've got to be quite careful, particularly in a place like Stellenbosch, where you apparently can't just buy any house and let it out to students. It has to have designated student house rights in that town. Well, that's what the estate agents are telling me. It hasn't yet hit a place like Grahamstown, but it is certainly something to be aware of. There's always that chance that the municipal bylaws can change, and the investment you thought was a great idea turns out to be a bit of a flop. The other thing is, if you go for the 5 bedroom digs model, it is also the model that's favoured by students for throwing massive parties. So I've heard of a few cases where, after the year-end exams, the owner moves in for a month and revamps the whole place and then relets it out in the new year. So that again is where the sectional title type investment might be a little bit more low risk.
And of course, you just bring up the cost of maintenance there would really skyrocket.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things that surprised me just reading the article, when it came through, was that, actually property has become incredibly expensive in places like Grahamstown. I mean, Stellenbosch, fair enough, I think that you can assume, but even Potch, I mean, you get the sense that property is quite expensive, and this idea of sort of low-cost student towns with the supporting infrastructure around it, where there's limited needs for traffic and transport. I didn't expect the property levels to be as elevated as they were, and maybe Jonathan's got some thoughts there as well, but it just feels like property's actually become quite expensive, and you can't get in at a ground level in a lot of these places anymore.
What are your thoughts on that?
Joburg CBD, I think, if you look at the history of it, has been almost forgotten, and we all know it's there, but the caution has always been, don't go to Joburg, it's unsafe. It's actually a lovely place. You've got streets you can walk down, you've got restaurants, there's some fantastic, it's great to go and spend a day there. And with that, there's an influx back to CBD. CBD is no longer seen as the dirty old town it used to be. And a lot of people are investing in the CBD, so you probably could pick up something at a reasonable value now. I know some of the units that have been sold recently have been sold for as little as 280,000 Rand. And those units, just for example, would fetch probably 3,500 Rand a month. So your return is actually quite reasonable if you consider that compared to 0.5% of value on your traditional home in the suburbs.
So is there enough supply? I mean, are there enough property developers working in, say, the Johannesburg CBD, if we're talking about that, building and regenerating these and renovating these old buildings, and is there the supply?
There's a lot going on, but I think the demand is outstripping supply at the moment.
And of course, would push up prices slightly.
Going forward.
The whole return thing is very interesting because contrary or different to the Joburg CBD experience, places like Stellenbosch and Grahamstown and Potch, some of the agents I spoke to said that their rental returns there are actually quite low. And one of the reasons has been that there's been a large-scale investment by the universities in new reses and new postgraduate reses, and that's one of the risks. Is you can buy even a small flat, rent it out to a student, you have lots of demand for 3-4 years, and then suddenly a new res goes up, or a new postgrad res goes up out on a hill somewhere that's very appealing to the students, and suddenly you've got a lot less demand the very next year. So that's something you need to be quite careful of, and also look at the amount of students that the university is able to accommodate from the total student population. That gives you some idea of the sort of demand you'd see every year.
Yeah, and I think the point Garth touched on there about the reses starting to come up is quite important, because they can bundle it in with school or tuition fees or whatever it is, so it becomes very difficult to compete with that from a return perspective. I think the main thrust of the article essentially was do your homework, because I think you've actually got to work out whether you actually have a market there, because I think a lot of the assumption that if you go to Rhodes, you go to Potch,
there will always be the steady
supply of
students,
and parents will pay because they're it's their little darlings, and they need to make sure that they're housed for a year. And I think economics says that's not happening at the moment, but I think that just you're not just competing against the property owners, you're competing against the varsities, and you've got to understand the patterns that are happening there.
One other interesting thing I picked up that's kind of obvious, but I never realized it until someone pointed it out to me, is that because demographics of universities are shifting so dramatically, and we're seeing a lot more people from disadvantaged backgrounds gaining access to university, what it means is that the student population's overall disposable income is less than it might have been, say back in the day where most of your peers would have been guys from private schools. Things are quite different, and that's where apparently there's quite a gap in the market, is student accommodation that is, I don't want to say cheap and nasty, but definitely catering, cheaper and catering to a lower income person who doesn't have money or a car to facilitate their commute in and out of town.
Yeah. Is that the type of, are there properties like that here in the Johannesburg CBD that is catering to students with low disposable income?
They're geared around exactly that.
Yeah.
And they cater for students. They provide Wi-Fi, they provide study facilities. So they're really are geared around student life and students, and they're affordable.
And are there other CBDs in South Africa where you're seeing the same model being replicated?
I'm quite sure there are. I'm not as well versed on those, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Maybe I can jump in. I mean, maybe one of the questions is how does an investor actually participate in this? I mean, do you buy a syndicated property, and what are the options?
A lot of them are syndicated, where a group of guys get together, they buy a building. You've obviously got to have the funding to renovate that, and that can obviously cost a pretty sum. But once it's done, you've got a very saleable product, particularly with the demand.
In terms of CBDs, anecdotal, so if you are listening to this and you want to follow this advice, just bear in mind it's anecdotal, but apparently Port Elizabeth, huge shortage of the sort of accommodation that we've been talking about.